welcome back to Civic Concord, a podcast where we share information, highlight important topics, and hear directly from people involved in town government. This is a Minuteman Media Network production. Today's conversation is part of our 2026 annual town meeting series, and we'll be talking about Article 33, MBTA Communities Bylaw Amendment with Planning Board member Rob Almeida. Hi, Rob.
Hello, how are you?
Good, thanks. Thank you for joining. I'm wondering, how many years have you been on the planning board?
I've been on the planning board for 3 years now.
Okay, great. And so you're taking this article for town meeting this year?
Yes.
And so when we're talking about MBTA communities, some people might be thinking, didn't we already do this? So I think, to back up for a minute, let's start and talk a little bit about the MBTA Communities Bylaw and what it does and how does it apply to Concord.
Absolutely. So the MBTA Communities Act was passed in January 2021, requires 177 cities and towns in the Commonwealth served by the MBTA to establish at least one district of reasonable size where multifamily housing permitted as by right. The law seeks to address the state's housing shortage by increasing the density, a minimum of 15 units per acre near transit, with most of the districts required within half a mile of a transit stop. Concord is served by two stops, West Concord and Concord, so that's why the law affects our town. Okay, and so we already did approve a bylaw. Was that 2 years ago now? It was at 2024 annual town meeting. And I know there was a significant amount of outreach that year and, so much conversation about the original adoption. And so what are we doing with this amendment here this year? So when we submitted our plan to the state and it was reviewed by the Attorney General's office, there were a few items that were not in compliance per their review. That being, half of the district must be contiguous. The bylaw cannot require a special permit for work in the floodplain conservancy district. Street and rail right-of-way areas must be included in the district area. And so those different, specific pieces of the bylaw, that guidance wasn't really clear when we were applying originally because it was kind of a new bylaw and communities were asked to make it work for their own towns and cities. Is that right? That is correct. There was a lot of guessing involved, in working with the compliance models, trying to make something that works not only with the law, but also within the town itself. Okay. And so we're going to be fixing those three components. That is correct. And so one change involves adding Concord Green to Subdistrict 4. Why was that one selected? Going through the different GIS models, trying to address the four primary state requirements, the board felt this was the best option that we had to put forward to be in compliance with the requirements. And another change moves certain floodplain requirements from a special permit process to a site plan review. Can you explain what that means in practice? So it removes the hurdle of special permit, but still will require developer or builder to come before the planning board to seek approval during site plan review. I think, some of the conversations that I've been having as part of this town meeting series are talking about kind of right-sizing the review to the project, and that sounds like that's kind of what the board was looking at for this one. It was, and the same thing for the article with the wireless as well. And so the state sets several requirements for MBTA community zoning. And I think we talked about some of them, but what are the other ones that we need to meet? So we touched upon being within half a mile of a station, the minimum density requirement of 15 units per acre, half the district being contiguous, and removing the requirement for a special permit within the floodplain conservancy district. Okay, and there's also required density of 15 units per acre and a calculated capacity of about 1,094 units. And this is feeling technical in this conversation now. But I think when we talked about MBTA communities a few years ago, there was a lot of conversation of, does that mean that number of units will actually be built? No, the majority of the land within these districts are already developed and occupied. So it would require developers to determine the feasibility of buying existing homes or properties, along with homeowners interested in selling their properties. It doesn't mean that 1,094 units will necessarily be built. On the flip side, it doesn't mean that 0 units will be built under this bylaw.
Okay. So you talked a little bit about the MBTA Communities bylaw as a effort to help with the housing crisis in the Commonwealth. And so this law requires that multifamily housing be allowed by right. What does that mean for local review and decision-making in Concord?
So by right means housing development refers to projects such as ADUs, which we've passed last year as well, or multifamily units that are approved without discretionary reviews like special permits or zoning board hearings if they meet the established zoning and land use regs.
Okay. And what role would the planning board still have if a project were proposed in the overlay district?
So if the project falls outside the established zoning and land use regulations, the developer would need to come before the board to have any waivers granted.
Okay, makes sense. And why did the planning board choose an option that avoided adding additional commercial parcels to the district? You chose the Concord Green section, right, for Subdistrict 4. Did you look at other parcels, or how did the board kind of consider that?
So we looked at different GIS models, and the challenges of trying to meet all the requirements were immense. And then
it's like a puzzle.
It is. It's absolutely challenging because there's so many pieces. You get 3 of them, and then you hit the 4th one, it won't be in compliance. So, you touched upon the commercial zoning. So we wanted to avoid trying to take any land that's zoned for commercial because we wanted to preserve that tax base as best we could.
That makes sense. And the contiguous part of the bylaw, that's just a requirement, right? Do we know why? Why that's part of it? I don't know if they've talked about that.
I would think your guess is as good as mine because honestly, I think they wanted, instead of having, a ton of 2, 3, 4, 5 acre parcels, they wanted to build probably in their mind, if there was a piece of property that was available or sufficient amount of land to kind of build a community.
That makes sense, actually. Yeah. So that they had a big enough area that if it was available to be developed, which, not everything in our zones they're currently developed. So that they could, take that and potentially build some real housing to help with the crisis. Okay. The presentation, you did it at a public hearing for the planning board. It mentions a deadline of June 12th, which is really right around the corner for this bylaw. What happens if Concord does not meet the state's compliance requirements by then?
So the town will be prohibited from certain grants, such as the MassWorks grant that could be used for upgrades to town's wastewater facilities or towards the construction of a new water treatment facility.
Okay, and those are pretty critical. So that's we rely on a lot of grants from the state. And is there anything about this new amendment that you think is commonly misunderstood that would be helpful for residents to know?
So I think we touched upon it earlier regarding, the building of 1,094 units. That's not going to occur with this. It's just providing the provisions for. The other bit is with Concord Green, adding Concord Green into zone number 4, it won't be developed in its entirety unless the entirety of every single property owner in Concord Green agrees to sell their units, and sell the land associated with it to a developer to basically, redevelop that area. And likelihood of that happening is pretty low.
Did you get a lot of questions at the hearing about this article? And were there any kind of tweaks to the presentation that were made, or?
No, just a couple clarifying, tweaks to just make things a little bit clearer. But I think, for the most part, people attending kind of understood where we were coming from and, saw what we were trying to do.
Yeah. And probably a lot of other communities have adjustments to make this year before this deadline.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, I think that covers it. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
No, thank you again for the opportunity.
Bye.